Okay, so I'm now recording officially, so you know that this is being recorded, right? And for the purpose of the 2020 Summer Research Institute at St. Thomas University, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College. And this video will also be posted on our Google website, so that other students and professors will have access to it. And my name is Alfred Cioffi. I'll get to the further introduction in a minute, but I want to start right away. This is a series of 4 workshops on ethics or bioethical issues in research, in scientific research, okay? And right away, for disclosure, I'm basing these 4 workshops mostly on a little textbook that was written by the National Academies of Science and Engineering and the Institutes of Medicine. It's called On Being a Scientist. The latest edition is the 3rd edition, all right? And this little booklet is available for free online. This is the URL, all right? This is the address. I'll post these PowerPoints also at the end of this lecture in the same site of the Google site, so you have access to the slides also, okay? So like I said, it's a series of 4 workshops. Today is the first one, and the next one will be this coming Thursday, and then next week, again, Tuesday and Thursday, all at 3 p.m. For people who cannot join at that time live, then these sessions will be recorded and posted on our Google website. Any questions or comments before I actually begin? Okay, moving forward then. I want to start right away with a case of ethics. So we're looking at essentially professional behavior in research, in scientific research, which has an impact on many people, because today there is a lot of science going on, and that science many times is translated into either medications or protocols or just the knowledge that humanity gains with this research and these publications. So the whole issue of professional ethics and professional integrity and personal integrity is very important, is essential really for science to be able to pursue truth, the truth about nature to the best of our ability. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to screen share somewhere here for the rest of the presentation. All right. So can you see my screen? Discovering an error? People
yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to minimize the tile then, put it on the side. So here's a case right away. 2 young faculty members, Marie, an epidemiologist in the medical school, and Yuan, a statistician in the mathematics department, have published 2 well-received papers about the spread of infections in populations. Kind of relevant to what's happening today in the world, huh? As Yuan is working on the simulation he has created to model infections, he realizes that a coding error has led to incorrect results that were published in the 2 papers. He sees with great relief that correcting the error does not change the average time it takes for an infection to spread, but the correct model exhibits greater uncertainty in its results, making predictions about the spread of an infection less definite. When he discusses the problem with Marie, she argues against sending corrections to the journals where the 2 early articles were published. Both papers will be seen as suspect if we do that. And the changes don't affect the main conclusions of the papers anyway. She says, their next paper will contain results based on the corrected model, and Yuan can post the corrected model on his webpage. So this is a scenario of 2 young researchers, faculty members at a university, who have published 2 papers together, all right? Marie is the epidemiologist, and Yuan is the statistician. So we'll begin with these 3 questions with regards to this case. What obligations do the authors owe their professional colleagues to correct the published results? How should their discussions be affected by how the model is being used by others? What other options exist beyond publishing a formal correction? So right away, I want to open it for discussion, being that these are workshops, and your input is very much appreciated. Anybody want to take the first stab at the first question? What obligations do you think that Yuan and Marie have to their colleagues, right? In other words, it could be their colleagues at the university where they're doing the research, or in the broader community of colleagues in the scientific world. In other words, do you think that they should tell others about the errors, or just wait for the next publication?
I think they should tell others.
Yes.
Especially, I think Yuan said that there was, even though the end was the same, that there was still more risk. So I think it's very important.
Right. In other words, it doesn't change the model itself, the way the infection spreads, okay?
So there's more uncertainty.
The rate of infection, or the average time, but it does change the uncertainty. In other words, the reliability of the model, okay? It's less reliable now, or has greater uncertainty or greater margin of error. So what do you think? Could this have an impact on some people who might be using this model in clinical situations with real life patients, for example, or a population in a city or in a nation?
Yes, of course, because it makes it less reliable. So maybe in case, like, let's say us as students, it might not be as important whether it's as reliable or not. But in the case when real patients are involved, or real populations are involved, it does need to be as reliable as possible.
Right. Okay. Any other opinions or difference in opinions? Many of these are open questions, okay, and they're open for debate, but at some point our conscience lets us know, right?
Since like the actual outcome doesn't change, but it makes the spread of the infection less definite, it would cause the people that were reading the papers or like trusted the papers to kind of like lose their trust in the people who wrote it. Does that make sense what I said? I don't know if I said that right.
Okay, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that maybe with the correction, this model is not as effective and it's not as interesting really at the end of the day, because it has a larger margin of error, and you lose interest in it?
Well, not as so much interest, but the people reading it, let's say they trusted the math and they trusted the words that they wrote. Now, since there's a little bit of a correction, they won't trust maybe the next paper as much if they were to release a new one.
Okay, right. So maybe it would have a negative effect on the professors themselves and their advancement of their research. Okay. We kind of spilled into question number 2 here. Should their decisions be affected by how the model is being used by others? In other words, if the model is being used by, say, a public health system in a particular country, where that disease is spreading maybe rapidly and they want to have some quick results for making policy and decision making, then there may be a sense of urgency, no? So I think that pretty much there would be a consensus that there is an obligation, right? There's an obligation on part of these authors to let their colleagues know that there has been an error in the publication. Later, we'll see in one of the other chapters that people make mistakes, and we'll get to that if this was intentional or unintentional. Okay, but none of us are perfect, and people make honest mistakes. But the point here is that as soon as a mistake is detected, there is the obligation to let the scientific community know that this error has occurred. Okay. And so the first thing that is done is just a letter written to the journals that published the articles. Assuming there are 2 different journals, there were 2 articles. So if it's a single journal, it's a little easier. If not, they have to contact both journals, right, where the results were published. And also further, what else could be done? What other options exist? See, beyond the formal correction, publishing the formal correction. It's already hinted at the last sentence here.
Maybe publishing in the next article the correction.
Right, yes, already they were planning to do that, but also this brings up another point here that Ewan can post the corrected model on his webpage. In other words, a lot of research today is also being done online, and databases are expanding, are becoming very large databases. In fact, that's a whole emerging field of big data and big data analytics, right? And so researchers have to manicure that data and have to maintain it on websites that are accessible to the research community of the world, because some people are far away, but they will still have access to the data depending on what kind of data it is and so forth, and what restrictions there may be on it. But typically, once an article is published, then that data should be available for the scientific community first to verify if the experiments were done correctly and if they can be reproduced, because that's one of the major ways in which the scientific community is able to move forward if the results are reproducible in other parts of the world, using, of course, the same conditions, right? Okay, so this is just like a little bit of an introduction to get the thing rolling here. We've gone through some questions. Now, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I teach at St. Thomas University. Been teaching there for about a dozen years now, biology and bioethics. Professionally, this is my background, my academic background. I have a doctorate in moral theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, Italy. It's a Jesuit university in Rome, in Italy. And I also have a doctorate in genetics from Purdue University. Has nothing to do with the chickens, okay? And that's in Indiana. And the reason for the 2 doctorates because of the bioethics. That bioethics is an interdisciplinary field that needs a competence in biology and also needs a competence in ethics, all right? Because these are emerging fields that are interdisciplinary. They draw from the scientific world, but they also draw from philosophy or theology, in my case, since I am also a Catholic priest here in the Archdiocese of Miami, been a priest for over 35 years now. And my background from before the priesthood was precisely in biology. I was, when I was your age, I was studying at MDC. Used to be the South Campus, now it's the Kendall Campus. Got my AA there back in the 70s, and then went to FIU when FIU was just starting in 1972. Graduated in 74 with a bachelor's in biology. So at that time, I just wanted to be a marine biologist. And then the good Lord had a different plan for me. But over the years, I saw the rise in bioethics as questions that used to be science fiction became reality in the lab. For example, stem cell research and human cloning, all right? And these questions not only have a scientific side to them, but they also have an ethical dimension. And that's when I went into bioethics and did the 2 degrees, the 2 doctorates, so that I have the competence in both fields. Okay, let's move back into the cases. We're going to go into the first chapter of this little booklet. Oop, what happened? There it is. There's going to be an introduction then to the responsible conduct of research. Okay, the whole idea here is how to do research in a professional way, And what we have is 3 main responsibilities or obligations. Again, all this is coming out from the little booklet that I told you about on being a scientist from the National Academy of Sciences. And we have, researchers have an obligation to honor the trust that their colleagues place in them. Researchers have an obligation to themselves. And researchers have an obligation to act in ways that serve the public. So let's look at each one of these briefly and see how they apply to our world of research and even in our personal dealings with other people. There's an obligation to honor the trust that their colleagues place in them, because like in any profession, there's a level of trust that occurs in the teamwork. Very seldom do you see papers today published by a single author. Typically, there are groups working in a lab, and the groups involve a principal investigator, which is the professor who is directing the investigation, and then there may be other professors associated with it, like in the case of Maria and Johan, which are 2 young professors at a university. And then typically there will be a number of students, graduate students, sometimes undergraduate students like yourselves, and maybe postdocs, which are those who have graduated recently with a doctorate degree, but are still doing some investigation to get publications, right? Scientific publications. So typically it's teamwork. In fact, when you look at some of the papers written in astronomy, for example, the first page of the paper is all authors. They could have 20, 30 authors, co-authors. Huge teams because the technology is very elaborate. The computations that are done and the big data crunching that happens throughout several labs throughout the world. And therefore, there's a lot of collaboration going on in science today. And therefore, there is an obligation to maintain that trust, to be faithful to the trust that is deposited on each one of us by our colleagues, okay? And that has many, many professional implications, because typically these are long-term relationships that are established, labs that are established in universities or other research institutions. It could be in government agencies. And these labs are run by the principal investigator over years and years, and sometimes decades. To themselves also, because of just personal integrity, right? Personal integrity. We want to be consistent in our value system, and it behooves us to maintain this professional standards with our research. And it also helps us. It's a win-win situation, because then it also helps us to advance, what is known as advancement in rank. Typically, one would enter, say, in the academic situation, enters as either a visiting professor or an assistant professor at first. And then within X number of years, one can apply into advancement of rank into associate professor. The associate professor is a more secure position, okay? And typically it involves a number of scientific publications to demonstrate competency in the field. And then beyond associate is full professor. And that also has its own recompense by way of an increasing salary and other benefits and so forth. So the obligation to oneself also pays off. I think that's pretty evident. Finally, there is an obligation toward the general public. Sometimes science, in the perception of non-scientists, in the perception of the general public, all right, may be suspect. There is this perception or misperception of the mad scientist. You may have heard that expression, the mad scientist who's in a lab conducting experiments that may affect humanity. And there's a lot of suspicion even right now as we speak with regards to the coronavirus pandemic, whether there was some human intervention in that, if it was engineered or not. So there are conspiracy theories going around, and all that hurts science, you see, because it can lose credibility in the eyes of the common folk who are not scientifically literate and not familiar with the scientific terminology or the scientific method and so forth. They certainly are not able to read an article in a scientific journal, because those articles are written in a very summarized way that needs a lot of knowledge with regards to the terminology that is used, very specific terminology and so forth. So it's very important to understand that science and researchers have an obligation to the public at large. Also because many times funding comes from public funding. The major sources of funding for research in the United States is NSF and NIH. The National Science Foundation, typically for non-human experimentation or non-human research, and then the National Institutes of Health, NIH, for human research, okay? And it's to the tunes of billions of dollars every year. And that's public money that comes from federal taxes. And therefore, there is a public trust also that is vested in these institutions and these agencies that fund the bulk of the research done in the United States and throughout the world. So yes, there's 3 levels of obligation there: to our peers, to ourselves, and to the public at large, to the general community. All right, so now going back to this case, I want to approach it from a slightly different angle. Those responsibilities, right, or these obligations, first to their colleagues. You notice that these are 2 young faculty members. It's implied that they are at some university. You know, one is in the mathematics department, the other one is in the medical school. So what kind of, knowing about these three obligations or bringing them forth, what kind of responsibility do you think that these, sorry, I'm trying to hide the tiles here, forgot. What kind of obligations do you think that these two young faculty members have to their colleagues, to their peers? Anybody?
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
you can go. Okay.
Maybe
So,
for a little bit of protocol, say your name first, and then just count to a couple of seconds, and if
Okay.
no one else jumps in, go ahead. Just your
That's a
first
good
name.
idea. Thiago, going first here.
Thank you.
So I believe that when you're talking about anything that involves the public, and as you're working with like other people, about this case, you're obligated to talk and like present facts. If you mistake and do like a mistake, and you just like you put to shadow an error, you're probably making something that is going to be false, and you can cause to be to your coworkers, they cannot trust you anymore because it cannot be true, you know. The work that they did, the whole work that they prepared and they invested a lot of time, it's not gonna worth the time and not the work, because one simple mistake that you just put it to the shadow because in an error and you published can just like get bigger and bigger, the mistake, just even if it is just a small thing.
Sure. In fact, you notice these are young faculty members. That could be the end of their careers if it's perceived. So the mistake was an honest mistake, you know, was an error in the coding. So it says there, it was an error in the coding. It was not done intentionally. But now if they try to hide it, it could be the end of their career at a very young age. It's just getting started. As you say, after years of investing in their graduate school and all their schooling that they have done for years and years. Okay, so it is important, it is serious, and we have to take it as such. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, let's move forward then. And for this first little PowerPoint that I have, we have to look at some definitions then, which is starting with ethics or ethical values. It has to do at the end of the day with human behavior, okay, or human conduct and the proper research conduct. So we have the same essential values that we would all appreciate, for example, as we relate to other people, to family and friends, okay? The type of values that we would like to be treated with and that we're called to treat others. Honesty, fairness, objectivity, openness, trustworthiness, and respect. So I'm sure we all appreciate being treated this way, and therefore, if it's good for the gander, it's good for the goose, right? Like we like to be treated this way, we should treat others this way at the personal level and at the professional level. There's a consistency there, and that's what we mean by a professional integrity that flows out of our personal integrity. And so when these values are applied in the context of research, then we have what is known as scientific standards, And some of these standards are actually written up in documents, in formal protocols and policy and so forth, and procedures. And some are not. Some are implied and are not written up, but it's part of the culture, it's part of the ethos. In other words, it's part of the ethical culture in the scientific world, okay? So not everything is written up, but there is also a scientific culture that implies all of these basic values. Now, when people violate these values, there is a misconduct. And in the context of research, is a scientific misconduct. And these are actually words and phrases that are defined even at the federal level, at the national level, with these funding institutions, so that there could even be fiscal and legal repercussions about this. And some of this has also been formalized into protocols and procedures, like I mentioned. For example, these, the FFP, as is known, the FFPs, you've seen this also in your studies already at the high school level, at the college level, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. I think that students are mostly familiar with plagiarism, right? Taking words from someone else and appropriating them as your own. That's why the first thing that I did when I started this presentation was to tell you where the sources are. This little booklet on being a scientist published by the National Academies of Sciences. Fabrication is making up data that is not there, and falsification is fixing the data, changing the data, so that the results look better than they should, or that they would with that particular experiment. And it could be in proposing or performing or reviewing research. Sometimes we review each other's research. Drafts are sent confidentially to peers to get their opinion and their impression, or also in the reporting of results. Now, beyond these, which are the three major ones, okay, making up data or changing the data, we have to be, and we can talk a little bit more about data manipulation, or sometimes you hear the phrase massaging the data, okay? There's a point where the massage becomes too much. It could be some massaging of the data. We have to be very careful. We'll talk about that a little later on. But we have to be very careful with how we do this manipulation of the data, okay? Just to give you a hint on examples, outliers. Outliers would be a measurement that is way off the average, way off the mean. In certain cases, that outlier may be discarded. In other cases, it may not be discarded. It depends. Okay, and then plagiarism, like I mentioned, is taking someone else's work as if it were one's own work, not giving credit to the other person. Beyond that, those three, all right, there's also something called questionable research practices. And these are other things that happen that are not necessarily these three. These are the most serious ones. But other types of questionable research, claiming that it's original when it's not original, and so forth, or maybe not providing all of the receipts for the expenses. There are many, many other things that can happen that are not, strictly speaking, fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, but are questionable and could question, at the end of the day, the integrity of the researcher, or even the institution that is housing that researcher. All right, and finally, in this little PowerPoint, I just want to make a distinction between scientific standards and scientific practices, because it's important to understand that standards are the ones that we are held up with regards to the ethics, with the professional behavior, okay, professional standards. But then there are also practices that may or may not have an ethical implication. For example, one common practice in many labs of the world is to have a general meeting Friday afternoons, at the end of the working week. If experiments have been going on during the week in the lab, then the PI, the principal investigator, who's typically the researcher who is running the lab, okay, will convene a meeting with all her or his students and other researchers that are involved in that lab, and they'll have a meeting. It may be a small lab, it may be a lab of 2 or 3 people. When I was doing my doctorate at Purdue, it was just the PI and myself. He would only take 1 or 2 students at a time. So I really had his full attention, and it was just spectacular. That's why I was able to do it in 4 years, which is kind of the minimum for a doctorate. Some labs have 5, 10 or more students. Those are large labs, okay? Many times those large labs, the PI will have 1 or 2 assistants that they're called RAs, research assistants or research associates. And typically they're on salary, and they help the principal investigator to manage the lab because there are many experiments going on at the same time. So there is a difference between these two. It's a difference of value, if you will, in the sense that the standards are the ones that we need to uphold with regards to the ethics of professional research, okay? And the practices vary and change. They're more practical, if you will, and more flexible. And many times it is the principal investigator who sets the practices for her or his lab, but also the institution or the agency that is funding the lab or where the lab is housed will have its own practices and protocols and so forth, procedures, wearing a badge, etc. Okay? But there is a difference between these two, and the ethics is pretty much on the standards, which tend to be also more universal by way of publication. All right, let's move on now to another topic, because this begs the question. I hope at this point you've been thinking, well, who is going to be my PI, right? Yeah, maybe it's the first time that you hear this word, but the principal investigator, as I mentioned, is the one who runs the lab, and it is his or her responsibility to make sure that everything in the lab runs well and smoothly, that the investigators, that the researchers are doing their work, that their questions are being answered, that they have the materials and protocols necessary to do the research, and so forth, okay? The PI is also responsible one way or another, making sure that all the researchers in her lab or his lab are at least civil with each other. They don't have to be best buddies and best friends, okay? But they at least need to uphold, again, professional standards in relating to one another of mutual respect and so forth. So this other little presentation is on advising and mentoring. And before looking at a case, I just want to make a little distinction here between the two. Advising, you are all familiar at this point pretty much with advising by way of the academics, the professor who advises the courses that you should be taking for next semester and the following semester, etc. So you stay on track in the program and graduate in a timely manner. Beyond the advisement is a mentor. A mentor is someone who takes you on under their wing, okay, and offers more encouragement and support beyond the academic or the research advisement itself, okay. It's more engaged. Sometimes they become friends, but it can just be maintained at the professional level, but they take a more personal interest in the well-being of their mentees, in their success beyond, for example, getting the degree, to get a job and to publish and so forth. So a mentor is a very good person to have. Not everyone has a mentor. Typically, you need at least an advisor to go through college. But mentors are very good people to have, and you can have several mentors even at the same time or sequentially. as one moves through life, especially in the research field. But mentors are good to have in one's life, okay? These are people of wisdom that can guide us. They've been there before, and they kind of know how the road is navigated. Having said that, let's look at this other case of Joseph. Joseph came back from a brief summer vacation convinced that he would be able to finish up his PhD in one more semester. Though he had not discussed the status of his thesis with his advisor or any other member of his thesis committee since the spring, he was sure they would agree that he could finish up quickly. In fact, he had already begun drawing up a list of companies to which he planned to apply for a research position. However, when his research advisor heard about his plans, she immediately objected. She told him, talk about a bucket of cold water, right? She told him that the measurements he had made were not going to be enough to satisfy his dissertation committee. She said that he should plan to spend at least 2 more semesters on campus doing additional measurements and finishing his dissertation. Joseph had always had a good working relationship with his advisor, and her advice had been very helpful in the past. Plus, he knew that he would need a good recommendation from her to get the jobs that he wanted. But he couldn't help but wonder if her advice this time might be self-serving, since her own research would benefit greatly from the additional set of measurements. Interesting, huh? There's a little bit more to the picture than we thought at first. Just Joseph finishing up in 1 more semester. But when he conversed that with his PI, which is this one, the advisor, the principal investigator, she said, no way you can do it in 1 more semester. Her opinion is that he needs 2 more semesters to finish up and to have significant data for the PhD. So let's look at these questions now. These 4 questions, and also know that some of these questions are open in the sense that they can be answered one way or another, all right? There's no right or wrong on some of these. It may depend on a number of factors, and I'll let you know those factors in a minute, at least one of them that is very significant at the PhD level. So, should Joseph try to change his advisor's mind? For example, should he review what his measurements already show and compare that with what the new measurements would add, and then ask his advisor to reconsider? If the new measurements do not add significantly to the data that he has already gathered, then he could make a case, right? Should Joseph talk to other members of his thesis committee to get their opinion? What actions could Joseph have taken earlier to avoid the problem? And finally, what actions can Joseph take now to avoid future disappointment? Okay, so the floor is open. Again, the protocol, just say your first name, wait a second, and then jump in.
Hello. So
Yes.
my name is Galilea. I think that Joseph should definitely include his mentors and like don't just like assume that your thesis is right without any consideration or any peer review before even like publishing or like rushing through the project, because like there can be some mistakes or anything, and if you publish it just like on your own and no peer review, there can be consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, good point. Now keep in mind that this is toward a PhD dissertation, okay? In fact, I wanted to make a little clarification here on the case. It should actually, where it says thesis, should actually be dissertation. Sometimes the words are used indiscriminately, but I can tell you that typically a thesis is for a master's degree, but a dissertation is for PhD. And can anyone tell me a little bit a major difference between a master's thesis and a doctoral dissertation? Anybody have an idea what's going on here? Well, I'll tell you, see, the PhD is what we know as a terminal degree. Terminal degree meaning that there's no more academic degree beyond the PhD. In fact, it means philosophical doctorate. The PH stands for philosophy, philosophical doctorate. It means that a person who gets a PhD is supposed to be able to philosophize about the science, the PhD, the subject matter, can philosophize about it. In other words, has a very sound opinion of weight, is pretty much an expert in that area, okay? And so that's another thing about a PhD is dissertation, that it has to be original work. Unlike a master's thesis can be a review of other people's work, or can be a duplication of someone else's work and so forth, but it doesn't have to be original research. But for a PhD to be granted, that dissertation has to contribute something in the field, in whatever field. And so that's very serious research. That's why it takes years and years to get a PhD, because it has to be original work. Now, in the case, here we have a conflict, if you will, between the student. This is a graduate student, right? Someone who is beyond a bachelor's, either at the master's level or at the PhD level. Those are called graduate students. And so this graduate student is in conflict with his PI, because the PI, the principal investigator, she believes that he doesn't have enough data to make his dissertation original, perhaps, or that the data is not robust enough, right? Maybe it's just preliminary data. It hasn't been confirmed. Try the experiment in another different way to see if it still works, something like that. So who knows more here in general about the field, the graduate student or the principal investigator?
The investigator.
The investigator, the advisor. She's the one who's running the lab, okay? She's running the lab. And so in her mind, he doesn't have enough data to warrant the defense. He has to defend that dissertation in front of the committee. So it's a delicate situation. Still, you know, not everything is lost for Joseph. What do you think about this first option here of him doing some, see if changing, having more data will change the results, for example? Having more measurements will change the result. What is involved in these measurements, and how could this be determined? Have you all had any statistics course yet? Statistics, we use statistics in the lab to see how many measurements are sufficient, because we cannot run the same experiment 1,000 times, right? We may run it several times. And at what point do we stop running the same experiment if we keep getting the same result? That can be measured and statistically come to what is known as a significant level or a confident level, confident value. And then at that confident level, we stop And we say, well, we have a 95% or a 99% or a 99.9% confidence that these results are true. And that's with regards to the rigor of the confidence level. So he could do that and then go back to the researcher. I think, personally, I like this option also because it may clarify the suspicion that Joseph has. Look at the suspicion at the bottom here. He couldn't help but wonder if her advice this time might be self-serving. Because if what's going to happen, typically these publications will have the name of the principal investigator also, all right? It will have Joseph's name and it would have her name also. In science, typically natural sciences, the first name on the article is the one who did the most work in the lab. And it's the graduate student who did the most work. So that would be Joseph's name, the first name. And the last name in the article is the principal investigator's name. And that's a convention, if you will. That's the convention that is used. In some other fields, it's the reverse. The PI comes first and the graduate students come last. But typically natural sciences, the graduate student that did the most work is the first one. And sometimes you even see notation if you have 2 or 3 students in the lab and the 2 or the 3 of them did equally pretty much the same amount of work, then they will put a little note, these 3 students contributed equally to the work done in the lab, to the research done, etc. But certainly the principal investigator is the one who knows best. Okay, but I think that at least the first option in my mind would clarify if she's just looking to get more work out of the student, okay, or if it's really that he needs more substantial data. How about talking to other members of the committee? Does he have access to the other members of the committee, right? Once the committee is formed, maybe you don't know these things because they're a little technical, but once the committee is formed, right? And Joseph does have some saying in his committee, who forms the committee. The committee will be other professors who are more or less familiar with that field. But typically it's a small committee, be 2, 3, 4 professors. And Joseph has access to those professors, okay? Either individually or as a group. He could also ask for a group meeting. It could be an informal group meeting just to discuss the data. He can do that. Or he could sit with each one of them individually, or maybe just 1 or 2 of them, the committee members. He has that option, okay? That's part of the research culture. Now, how about from before to what could Joseph have done to avoid the situation of disappointment? Anyone in retrospect? Now, this is asking us to go back to when Joseph first was signed up in that lab, all right? With the principal investigator, with the advisor. What should have been done then that obviously was not done? Let's go back to the case.
Well, this is Nikki. He probably should have talked to his advisor before instead of waiting so long and assuming that whatever he was going to do was right and that they would agree, because let's say like she didn't agree. So he had more time to plan it out and do more measurements, and he wouldn't have had to have 2 more extra semesters on his PhD.
Exactly, yes. In other words, to talk about the expectations, very important to talk about the expectations from the get-go, all right? And in fact, again, my 2 experiences, both in Rome and at Purdue, That's one of the first things that is done, even just before the professor commits to taking this student in their lab. What are the expectations? What is a reasonable time? Of course, it cannot be pinpointed down to the month or even the semester, right? There has to be some flexibility, but at least an expectation to talk about what amount of research really the professor is looking for, that it would be substantial enough to be able to be called original work and defend in a dissertation, in a defense. In my particular case, I'll tell you, typically in science, not always, but many times in science, what happens is you try to get at least one publication, one peer-reviewed publication a year with the research, and that becomes one chapter of the dissertation. And so I was very fortunate because like I said, since I was the only student in the lab and I was spending day and night in the lab, sometimes 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I had to go prep the bacteria. We were working in genetics in the structure and function of DNA, the relationship between the structure and the function of DNA. And we would do transformations in bacteria and then grow them overnight. And sometimes I would have to go into the lab at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to extract the DNA from bacteria. And that's, you have no life when you're in a lab, basically. you live in the lab, but I was able to publish one scientific article every year for 3 consecutive years. So those became the first 3 chapters of my dissertation. And then the first chapter, it can be speculative. In other words, you can write up a chapter that is projecting the research to the future, where you think it should go after this. And that first chapter is speculative because it's done before the actual research, doesn't have to be published. But that became the first chapter in my dissertation, and that was it, 4 chapters. Mm-hmm. And that was substantial enough to be able to defend it. But my principal investigator, Dr. Stein, agreed to that. And so we moved forward. And that's why I was able to do it in 4 years. Mm-hmm. But it's important to know that the expectations are crucial. And they should be talked about from the beginning, from the get-go, so that there are no misunderstandings later on. Therefore, in view of this, he certainly, well, what do you think about number 4 then? What do you think that Joseph should try to get from his principal investigator to try to kind of pin her down a little bit to how much more data or measurements she thinks would be sufficient, right? To, for example, if he's at the 95% level, if a 99%, then that could be measured statistically, you see, because we're going to be dealing with numbers. In other words, the lab, the experiments in the lab will have a particular result and so forth. Many times, I can tell you also, many times experiments in the lab don't work, and you have to keep repeating it and tweaking it and so forth until the experiment actually works, okay? And then once it works, then you repeat that experiment again to make sure that, that it didn't work just by chance. So by how many more measurements would he have to do to get a 99% confidence level, which would be what is known as a p-value as 0.01, right? Which is a high confidence level, by the way. So definitely he needs to clarify with the professor, and maybe he can still do it in 1 more semester. The extra measurements that she's asking for, maybe if he redoubles his time and at the lab, maybe it can be done still within the semester, but at least he'll know how many more measurements he would have to do to satisfy the requirement for the advisor to allow him to defend his dissertation, right? Okay,
Yes.
so all this for keeping in mind then that mentoring and advisement are crucial, because these are the people who guide you in your advancement in academics, all right, through college and then through graduate school. Let's move on now to the third one, because this one now is going to be looking at the data. Been talking about data for some time, but now let's look at how we treat data. Again, keep in mind, this is all from the ethical, bioethical perspective, okay? So it regards the human behavior, the conduct of people in the lab. Here's another case. Deborah, a third-year graduate student, and Kamala, a postdoctoral fellow. Postdoctoral fellow is someone who has recently graduated with a PhD and is working in a lab, is not a professor yet, is a postdoc, they're called postdocs, okay? And they can be working in a lab for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, getting more research done and publishing those research results so that get more publications. And then once they apply for a teaching job, they will have those publications under their belt, as it were, to allow them to get a good position wherever they are applying. It could be at a university, or it could be at a research institution, or it could be with a government agency, etc. Okay, so they have made a series of measurements on a new experimental semiconductor material using an expensive neutron test at a national laboratory. When they returned to their own lab and examined the data, a newly proposed mathematical explanation of the semiconductor's behavior predicts results indicated by a curve, right? So this is informative in the sense that, for example, the results are a curve and not a line, a straight line. Okay, so a straight line implies a linear progression. A curve implies more of a geometric progression, like a doubling effect. For example, what has a geometric progression in life? It's going on right now in our own bodies. Good old mitosis, right? Cell division. From one cell we get two daughter cells, and each one of those two daughter cells, when they mature, they become mother cells, and each one of those two has two more. So that's 4. And then those 4 have 2 more each, that's 8. So you see, it's doubling the population of cells at every generation. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You see, it's not linear. Linear would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But this is geometric. It's a doubling of the population. And typically, when that is put in a graph, it looks like a curve, not a straight line. All right. So during the measurements at the National Lab, Deborah and Kamala observed electrical power fluctuations that they could not control or predict that it was affecting their detector. They suspect the fluctuations affected some of their measurements, but they don't know which ones. When Deborah and Kamala begin to write up their results to present at a lab meeting, see, the Friday afternoon lab meeting, which they know will be the first step in preparing a publication, Kamala suggests dropping 2 anomalous data points near the horizontal axis from the graph they are preparing. These are the outliers that I talked about. She says that due to their deviation from the theoretical curve, the low data points were obviously caused by the power fluctuations. Furthermore, the deviations were outside the expected error bars calculated for the remaining data points. Deborah is concerned that dropping these 2 points could be seen as manipulating the data. She and Kamala could not be sure that any of their data points, if any, were affected by the power fluctuations. They also did not know if their theoretical prediction was valid. She wants to do a separate analysis that includes the points and discuss the issue in the lab meeting. This is Deborah. But Kamala says that if they include the data points in their talk, others will think the issue important enough to discuss in a draft paper, which will make it harder to get the paper published. Instead, she and Deborah should use their professional judgment to drop the 2 data points now, and obviously not bring it up at the meeting. Okay? So, some questions. What factors should Kamala and Deborah take into account in deciding how to present the data from their experiment? Should the new explanation predicting the results affect their deliberations? Should a draft paper be prepared at this point? And finally, if Deborah and Kamala can't agree on how the data should be presented, should one of them consider not being an author of the paper? Let me interrupt for a moment because I think there's some chats here. There's one chat, just in case. Okay, that's Dr. Pina, fine, thank you. Okay, so open the floor for any questions or comments or opinions. Let's go one by one. What factors should Deborah take into account, Deborah and Kamala, in deciding how to present the data?
Thiago
Dr.
here.
Could you actually go back a moment because it kicked me out when you were explaining so I could read the selection of data?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm sorry. My internet is failing.
No problem, no problem. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, so here's the case itself. So the first question is, what factors should Kamala and Deborah have in mind when deciding about these data points? For example, there are 2 labs involved, right? First, there was a national lab where the electricity was fluctuating, but then they went to their own lab. Okay, and this is the lab meeting of their own lab. Also keep in mind, those 2 data points fell outside of the error bars. So again, another reference to statistics. Statistics. These graphs, and we can do several statistics like a QQ graph, for example. You'll learn these things in college, where it tells you where the bulk of the data is, what is the mean, the average, the mode, the standard deviation, 1 standard deviation, 2, 3 standard deviations away from the mean, okay? Error bars, confidence level, all these things you learn in a basic course in statistics that you'll have during your, if you haven't had it yet, you have it at the college level. So when points fall out of the error bars, typically they can be considered outliers. But it depends if they need to be included or not. But in some cases, outliers could be dropped. For example, that's when we look at the median instead of the mean, all right? The most abundant number, for example, in the data and things like that. You'll learn that if you haven't yet in statistics. But in other words, there are several things that they could do to analyze the data from different perspectives using different statistics and see if it varies a lot or not, if the results vary or not, okay? By using different types of statistical calculations, and to see if those 2 points need to be included or not. How about this new explanation? This has to do with a new explanation about the curve, that the results, the theoretical explanation should follow a curve. It could be a parabol or something like that. And it's a new explanation, right? So this new explanation may also have some degree of certainty or error in itself. Has this new explanation been verified elsewhere already? Or how much credibility does this new explanation have? Because those two data points fall out of this particular curve. Okay. Could be that looking at other explanations, the data points would be included in another, let's say, more conservative explanation of, or theoretical explanation of the experiment that they're running, of that semiconductor. How about this difference between a draft paper or say, a definitive paper?
Well, I think a draft paper would they can surely show some the ideas that they search, the new ideas, the new explanation, but it's not certain. There's not a definite observation. I don't think it's I think if they go and decide to do their explanation between using the mistake and keeping the two outliers, and you do another one with the draft, and you combine these two to show a certain point, a certain observation, that and the results, the outliers doesn't change the result.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's no problem. Even if you take out the outliers, if they are not changing any specific data from the graphic, I don't think it's gonna be a mistake taken out. But I think it is ethic that you show the mistake. I think it's ethic that you point out that you had two outliers, that they were caused by this thing, that were the problems by the power fluctuations.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is more if you don't have a certain explanation, you have a draft, you should point out what you have certain, and then you just show the draft just to a second explanation, a second point of view.
Mm-hmm. Right. In other words, I think you're both suggesting more or less the same, to repeat the experiment and see if the outliers show up again or not, right?
Yes.
And this time, make sure that there's no fluctuation in the temperature, in the electricity, because the current is a semiconductor, so that's supposed to transmit current at a certain rate and so forth. They're testing precisely the transmission of current. So to me, that's a key element in the experiment. It's not like the temperature in the room, the AC fluctuated or something like that. That could be secondary. But this is actually related to the properties of the semiconductor.
Yes.
And so the second time, basically, there was a flaw in this experiment in the power fluctuation, over which they had no control because they were in a national lab, somebody else's lab. So is your feeling that this experiment definitely needs to be repeated?
Yes. I feel
right? It needs to be repeated. So the downside about the draft paper is that the publication may be delayed, but the upside, the good thing about the draft is that the potential errors would be eliminated with a further experiment, where there could be a certain guarantee, if you will, that there's no fluctuation. And there are ways to do that by measuring the current and so forth, and making sure that there are no fluctuations this time. Okay, in fact, there's a section of the scientific paper that is called the materials and methods, the M&Ms, materials and methods, and that's where it's described, even briefly, the procedure that is used so that this experiment can be replicated anywhere else in the world with the same materials and so forth. So I think that these two researchers definitely need to make sure next time that there are no current fluctuations, because that's essential to their measurements. Okay, and again, if we look at those values that we saw earlier of, let me see here for a moment, where were we? Yes. No, sorry. Yes, in one, when we talked about the basic values, honesty, fairness, objectivity, all of these would apply for the lab meeting, right? I think their colleagues have a right to know what happened because they're all in it together, even if their names are not in the paper, but the principal investigator, because these are, one is a graduate student and the other one is a postdoc. So they're not going to be publishing on their own. They will have at least a third name, which will be the name of the principal investigator, of the advisor of the lab. And so that advisor needs to know what's going on, okay? Plus, it's not, again, it's not something that these two researchers caused. It was just part, unfortunately, they had no control over this national laboratory that the current happened to be fluctuating at that point, at that moment. This is not something that they caused on purpose. It does cause delay in their research, but that's the nature of research. Okay, so if we look at the last question. What do you all think about this last question? Should they, if one of them decides on moving forward and publishing the thing, hypothetically, if they could, should the other one then that has reservations, should she omit her name from the paper?
No, I don't think it is right. Like, even though she doesn't agree, one of them doesn't agree.
Right.
So the paper couldn't be presented, you know, like, because the other person has authority to all the work that she spent it on there. And so it's like a 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
I think if one omits, doesn't want to put her name on it, it's like omitting all the work that she did. That's gonna be like, I don't know. I don't think it is right.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I can say.
Right. In other words, it brings up another point here that people researching in a lab, they're not really independent of that lab, okay? The experiment was done under the auspices, if you will, of that principal investigator. And so if either Deborah or Kamala decide to publish on their own, the PI needs to know that. They cannot just go ahead and try to publish this on their own because they were using lab equipment, lab protocols, and all that. And so they're not really at liberty to publish on their own. And if one of them wants to move in that direction, the other one actually has the responsibility to let the advisor, the principal investigator, know what's going on. Because we're not really independent agents when we are in a lab situation. Even the institution where the lab is housed has, a stake at it because it will be, oh, that happened at that university. Okay. I remember going back to my experience at Purdue. It's a big tech school. Engineering is huge, all different. It's one of the top engineering schools in the nation in many different fields, including genetic engineering. But at that time, what was big at the beginning of the 2000s was cold fusion. I don't know if you remember that little phrase, but cold fusion, hot fusion is essentially a nuclear bomb But cold fusion is to get atoms to collapse, but not heating up in a super massive way, and to extract energy out of it. And one lab at Purdue was claiming to have done cold fusion, and then it turns out that the results actually were being influenced by some kind of magnet that it was stored in a cabinet near where the experiments were being done. And the magnetic field of that magnet inside a cabinet was affecting the results. And it was not detected until it was actually published. And then the professor had to make a retraction and everything else. But at that point, it has already gotten out that Purdue had managed to get cold fusion done. So it was a big, huge thing that turned out to be a fake, turned out to be an artifact. It's called an artifact. Okay. So we have to be careful with these things, and we're not really independent agents when we are in a lab situation. Okay. Let's move on to, been at it for about an hour and a half. One more. We looked at that one already. Yep. Oh. Okay, well, finally, this is just going to be brief now because you've been very patient to stick with it for about an hour and a half. Mistakes and negligence. And I've been mentioning this a little bit already, but I just want to highlight it now, that one thing is to make a mistake, an honest mistake, where there was no ill intent, there was no fabrication, there was no falsification or plagiarism, all right? And another thing is to be negligent about an experiment and to do it either sloppily or to actually falsify or use different reagents or different quantities than the protocol and so forth, and to change it on purpose. All right, so here it has to do, at the end of the day, with that other faculty that we have, is the will. So we have two great faculties as humans, and these two faculties are pretty much unique to us as a species, the intellect and the will, to the point of being able to have abstract thought and communicate abstractly, all right? The only species that can do that due to our intellect, the large volume and surface area that we have of the gray matter on our brain, but also the will, volition, that we can will things. So one thing is to know things, and another thing is to will them. And that's where freedom resides. Freedom resides in our will, okay? And so mistakes will be made, and mistakes need to be understood. We have to be careful with mistakes because some mistakes could be dangerous by way of causing a burn or an explosion or something, or a spill in a lab with acid or whatever. And that's why one of the first things we always cover in research is safety, right? Safety for the people and safety also for the equipment. Some of the equipment is expensive to the tunes of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars. So mistakes will happen and we try to minimize them. But negligence is different because negligence, we're culpable, all right? Either by failing to follow a protocol or by deliberately changing a protocol, seemingly to our advantage, to fake data, etc. So you understand what's going on here. From that perspective, we can go back to those are three cases that we looked at and see whether there may have been mistakes, honest mistakes, or if there was actual negligence going on. This first one on the error that was discovered, okay? So again, Marie is the one who is the doctor, the medical doctor, the epidemiologist, and Johan is the mathematician. He's the one who's doing running the computer model. And he says, he realized that a coding error, all right? So this coding error, do you think that was done on purpose by Yuan or just a human mistake? Anyone?
A human mistake, maybe?
Yes, because I don't know if you've ever done any computer coding, but it's tricky. You have to be very concentrated on the words that you use because each word has a meaning and it's an operation for the computer to do. And so it's not hard to make a mistake in coding, especially when it's young and not too experienced, etc. And what he should have done is to run the model before applying it, right? To make sure that the bugs are out. But even that's why we have these different versions of phones and even computer programs. There are all these different versions. Each version takes care of the bugs, right? What they call the bugs. Well, bugs are errors in coding. That some of this coding has become so complicated that they're not caught the first time around. Hmm? But when they are caught, then now we know, and there is a responsibility there. Okay, so we can say, at least in this case, that no, it was not done intentionally. It was an honest mistake, but then it was caught, and so now they know, and now the will should be engaged in correcting that mistake. So if they don't correct it, then it becomes negligence. If they don't correct it and they move forward with the publication, then, or they don't alert other people that there was an error, then it becomes negligence, it becomes culpable. Okay, briefly on the second one, Joseph, with regards to getting his PhD done, how about his principal investigator? Sorry, we don't know her name, but the doctor here, what are her intentions? He's having second thoughts about her intentions. We don't really know, okay? They say we tend to trust people, at least the first time around. There's a little saying, kind of popular wisdom, right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Okay, so we tend to trust people, but if we are disappointed in that trust, if we are betrayed in the trust, the second time around, we're just going to be more careful, right? We're going to be more careful. But anyway, all this could be avoided, as we spoke, by having that conversation, very frank, open, sincere conversation at the beginning before jumping into the lab. Before jumping into the lab. Third one. Okay, we're back to Deborah and Kamala. Was there any ill intent in fluctuating that current? Did they fluctuate the current on purpose on their experiment?
No.
No, obviously not, right? They were subject to whatever was happening at that national laboratory. But now that they know that that was happening, that the lights were flickering basically, now they know, now the will is engaged. So again, honesty, transparency, integrity, professionalism calls for divulging that. Minimally, I would say bring it up to the principal investigator and let the principal investigator decide where he or she wants to go with it. Okay, but at least let the principal investigator that happened, and then the principal investigator needs to decide, well, we're gonna then repeat the experiment, or we're gonna do this other statistics on it to see if we can dispense with those two outliers and still have a robust result. Okay, folks, basically that's what I have for you today. Any overall questions, comments, anything? All right. let's see, there may be one other chat. If it's the same one. We'll be meeting to discuss our assigned projects. Oh, okay, good, yes. So yeah, Galilea, she's one of my students. Within the next couple of days, probably I'll send you some emails, start doing some work, all right? Frankly, in the spirit of openness and disclosure, I've been dealing with putting together these workshops. Plus, there was the death of a dear old lady who I knew for many, many decades, and being a priest, I've been involved in that. And also, we're opening the churches again in the parish and the Catholic parishes. So all of a sudden, my life got very complicated the last 2 weeks. And I've had little time to pay more attention to you all, but I will during this week, okay? So I'll be in touch with you by email, and we can also talk on the phone. I'll send you my phone number so that we can also talk by phone. Once I send you my phone number, you can call me anytime, and we can discuss anything you like. All right, so once again, thank you very much. Oh, maybe another chat before I close here. Let's see, I guess it just shows one, but it must be a new one. Oh. Okay. So as I said, we'll make a YouTube out of this and then post it in that Google site that we have, together with a PowerPoint that you can review. And also you can download that little book that I talked about at the beginning. Let me show it again. It's in the introduction, first slide. You can download it for free. Just punch in on being a scientist. You can go through it and you'll see how my presentations are really coming out of this very succinct. It's a good guide. It's a good guide. It's like a little manual to have throughout your college years as you engage in undergraduate research. All right, thanks again for your engagement and your interest. And
Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. I'll be
Thank you,
doing
Dr.
the.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. If you want to read up a little bit, if you have time, you can look at the next 3 chapters on that booklet, and that's what I'll be covering for Thursday. All right.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. All the best. We'll be in touch. Let me.
Thank you, Father Cioffi.
Okay. All the best. Bye-bye.